Alright, hello everyone, and thank you for tuning in once again to the Black Box Podcast. BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. Today we are revisiting the Casey Anthony trial, and I was actually doing an upload about this recently, and somebody recommended that I check out some of the material that has been posted on the internet, as well as the Marcia Clark Investigates episode on Casey Anthony. And I gotta tell you flat out to begin with, I am not a big fan of Marcia Clark. Of course, more famous for being the prosecutor in the O.J. Simpson case. But that's how most people were introduced to somebody like Marcia Clark. And I was watching some of the interviews that she was doing promoting her episode, and I actually have not seen it in its entirety, but you see some fragments, some clips, as well as her explanations, because that's what we really want to discuss today. The theory that Marcia Clark put forward, as well as an additional video, which is kind of like a homemade video, a whole movie sort of Kaylee Anthony, and that's posted by Who Is Mom Detective. Hopefully I'll be able to post a link to that later on. But the thing with Marcia Clark is, it's not so much what she says on television, it's not so much what we saw during the O.J. Simpson case, it's what they say about her behind closed doors that went on in the background. What people are saying that Marcia Clark was like when the cameras were off, where she's choosing not to put this evidence forward, she's choosing not to call this witness, then getting mad and regretting her decisions. Oh, I messed this up. And it's what people are saying about her. Granted, some of that is hearsay, but it's like, when you hear that side of Marcia Clark, I just completely believe that there's a different side of her that we don't really get to see on television. And that's why I was very skeptical going into just anything to do with her. It's like they were even talking about promoting this television series that was having Marcia Clark serve as the executive producer. And I was just like turned off, It's like I'm not a fan of hers. Now, when it comes to the theory that's put forward, if you're going to be talking about hard evidence, I think it's somewhat credible. The Marcia Clark theory is as follows. I was told by the person who gave me the suggestion that to look for two specific words, foolproof suffocation, repeating suffocation. This relates to the duct tape that was found at the crime scene, or we should say where Caylee Anthony's body was exhumed, was buried, all of those things. Now, what does this have to do with anything? Well, the Marcia Clark theory is sort of like the duct tape was wrapped around Caylee Anthony's mouth, skull, even wrapped around her hair. The duct tape went completely around her head. I was shocked back in 2011 when Casey Anthony was found not guilty, because I was like, their theory was that this was an accidental drowning. By they, I mean Jose Baez and the defense team, the kind of explanation that was provided about why Caylee Anthony was buried in a shallow grave nearby, was that Caylee Anthony had died in the pool and George Anthony buried the body. Their theory, which Jose Baez still stands by to this day, if I recall, in public anyway, he says these things, is that Casey Anthony didn't even know what he did, that George Anthony took the body and buried it in a shallow grave. That's what they've been putting forward. But I was like, how on earth is that possible if there was duct tape wrapped around her? The duct tape is wrapped around her skull. How would that be possible? That's not some kid who drowns in the pool. That's a murder thing. And I completely entertain. I'm completely aware. You might be thinking like, oh, well, they could always say like they wrapped the body in plastic before they buried it and they used duct tape to seal the plastic. No, because this is what the Marcia Clark theory has kind of uncovered, is that the duct tape was actually right against the body. During the decomposition, the duct tape came off of the kind of mouth and jaw area and was pushed to the side. Because if you even read on Wikipedia, it would say something like, the duct tape was found to the side of the skull. And what the Marcia Clark Investigates team kind of uncovered is that happened during the decomposition. So it's like, that's just something that, firstly, it's completely heinous. And it's most likely that, a mother did that to her own child. In fact, there's almost no other possibility, because what they had was Casey Anthony was searching on the internet for foolproof suffocation. She was learning about this. And they've also found out that this was done at a very specific time when only Casey Anthony would have been at home. That's the sort of nutshell version. So, the short story is, they've almost confirmed, 99.9%, that the skull was wrapped with duct tape, meaning that Casey Anthony wrapped Kaylee Anthony's head completely around 360 degrees with duct tape multiple times, and she was buried in the shallow grave. What they don't really know is, was she given Xanax? Was she given chloroform? I would say that this casts a little doubt on something that was put forward by one person. Like, one person was on YouTube, like, she was claiming to be Casey Anthony's cellmate. Maybe you've seen the video if you followed the case. She was claiming to be Casey Anthony's cellmate, saying that what Casey Anthony would do is, on nights when she was going out and she didn't want to find a babysitter, she would knock Kaylee Anthony out with chloroform. I mean, also there's the famous Zanny the Nanny, Zanny being a code word for Xanax. So they sort of think that that was something that could have also been, but Marcia Clark explained that very clearly. The remains were found at such a late time that the decomposition had erased all possibility of knowing, was she given Xanax, was there chloroform involved. So what they can say is, if the duct tape is wrapped around, completely around the skull, 360, you have to hear me out on this, that means that it was not an accident. Someone does not accidentally drown in the pool and then they wrap the skull in duct tape to make sure that the dead body can't breathe. That didn't happen that way. That was a murder. That was a murder. And, I mean, you have Casey Anthony at home Googling or searching on some search engine, maybe it was Yahoo at the time, about foolproof suffocation. There's also that other thing we mentioned. The other video. It's like the home movie of Kaylee Anthony, and she's just making these sounds. Once again, it's from like it's posted under the name Who is Mom Detective. She's making these sounds, just like, he, and like, before you just even start to think about that stuff, it sounds like she's saying the words I kill, and then very clearly, a female adult says, I kill. And it's just weird stuff. And, I mean, okay, mostly you know, that's Casey Anthony, right? And people even say they can see Casey Anthony in the reflection of certain things, and it's like, it's just weird, disgusting stuff. On this channel, we've talked a lot about psychopaths and sociopaths and narcissists. Does Casey Anthony fall into any of those boxes? Now, please do not quote me on this, but the only thing I want to say is she was a freak. I mean, I can't really think of a better way to describe it in terms of, do we really want to use any sort of psychological diagnosis right now? Other than the fact that she was a despicable human being. That's like all I can really sort of say. But it's highly probable that Casey Anthony murdered her daughter because she didn't want to deal with her anymore. Once you sort of look at everything that went on, though, we talked about last time about how there were at least 7 different imaginary personalities, fictitious personalities, that Casey had created. She made up 2 individuals claiming that they were Casey's father. Neither one of them existed. She would have people wait in the parking lot for imaginary friends. She created the fictitious story about working at Universal Studios. She created the fictitious persons, Zenaida Fernandez Gonzalez, Zanny the Nanny. Otherwise, Zanny the Nanny, of course, could also be using Xanax to drug her own daughter. I mean, it's just so many things like that. I mean, is this someone who doesn't have a grip on reality, or is this person a sociopath? That's why I just said she's a freak, and I mean, like, I wish I had a more articulate, more intellectual thing to say, but I don't. It's like, it's just kind of so many despicable things happening all at once. And I do say that because her daughter was found dead in a shallow grave. And if this theory is true, and there's a lot of hard evidence to support it, that Marcia Clark has put forward, if this theory is true, then Casey Anthony murdered her daughter because she didn't want the responsibilities of being a mother, and this was the easiest way out. Now it's like, they were talking about this stuff in the Access Hollywood interview with Marcia Clark, where they were just sort of like, how on earth does it ever come to this? How do these things come to that? Like, even the concepts of people who murder their spouse, it's like you can't just get a divorce. I mean, a woman murders her daughter because she doesn't want the responsibilities. She couldn't just walk away. I mean, it should never really come to this. It really takes a certain type of personality. Someone who is probably filled with a lot of bloodlust. Once again, we're not using some serious psychological terminology here. Just someone who has a lot of bloodlust and rage or something like that. Marcia Clark also said something very interesting when she's like, most of the time, the jury gets it right. And when she said this, once again, that was in the Access Hollywood interview, and, that's a lighthearted entertainment show, but they were just laughing about it. I mean, they're not trying to be dark and serious, but I was even kind of laughing. Marcia Clark, the prosecutor in the O.J. Simpson case, is saying, most of the time the jury gets it right. Marcia Clark, who's promoting an episode and theory about Casey Anthony, says most of the time the jury gets it right. And I was just like, well, you got to hear her out a little bit more. She's like, she was a prosecutor for 14 years, a defense attorney for 14 years. She's like, in 28 years, most times, that she was working with juries as a practicing lawyer, attorney, the juries often get it right. It's just in these very extreme instances of O.J. Simpson and Casey Anthony, the vast majority of people believe that the jury got it wrong. Although, we also have something going on with O.J. Simpson and Casey Anthony. We have the court of public opinion. That's right. They've been absolutely condemned, vilified. Everybody thinks that they're guilty, right? I think O.J. Simpson is guilty. I've said very clearly on this channel multiple times, I believe the possibility that he was working with an accomplice. Jeffrey Toobin doesn't agree with me, but hey, that's all right. I believe Casey Anthony is guilty of murdering her daughter, Kaylee Anthony. There might be some exceptions, though, in the court of public opinion, like somebody like Amanda Knox, for example. I personally don't believe she is guilty of the murder of Meredith Kircher, but the internet has an enormous amount of individuals who believe that she's guilty. The court of public opinion can be wrong. I mean, I can also be wrong. If I had a flippin' nickel for everything that I've said on this channel that just I had to modify, because we talk about a lot of theories. And when you're discussing a theory, that means you don't actually know everything 100%. So that's one of the reasons why we have these discussions. And someone recommended these great sources about Casey Anthony to me so I could learn more. And then it does change your perspective on some things. But on the one hand, it's like, it still doesn't change the fact that many of us already believe that Casey Anthony was guilty. It's just a little bit more kind of concrete evidence to go along with that. Once again, if the duct tape was found wrapped completely around her head, that's not indicative of anything other than murder. It is implausible to suggest that duct tape is wrapped around a 2-year-old's head and buried in a shallow grave if it was an accident. Okay, even if the body was buried in a shallow grave without any duct tape, you might be able to concoct a story that would involve something that was not murder. They feared for their lives. They thought they were all going to jail or something like that. But, I mean, as far as I know, it's illegal to dispose of remains like that, but somehow that was never brought up. I guess because, I mean, the lawyers were probably somewhat careful. They were saying very clearly that George Anthony took the body and buried it, and that Casey Anthony had no idea what he was doing. I guess Jose Baez and Cheney Mason were just being very sneaky. I mean, that's one of the reasons why people are so frustrated with the legal system, because of all the sneaky and slimy tactics that they have to use to just kind of weasel their way around the law. And Alan Dershowitz said on the day of the verdict on the evening news, he's just like, that's what our legal system is. And you might not be the biggest fan of Alan Dershowitz. I'm sure not. But it's like, it's one of those things. It's just like, the law is about the lawyers trying to win their case regardless of what happened. I mean, to kind of give some insight into his perspective. There are a few people out there that insist upon Casey Anthony's innocence, but this is a much harder thing to prove than some of these other people out there. Like, I mean, it's not only based on her kind of unlikable personality. It's not only based on the 31 days of partying and not reporting her daughter missing. It's kind of these hard evidence things. The search for foolproof suffocation, duct tape wrapped around the skull. One of the things that I've always wondered about was, like, Casey Anthony seems like somewhat of a slob, but I've mentioned this on the channel before ages ago, but it's like, did she actually put garbage into her car to mask the scent of the dead body? I mean, the rotting pizza. Like a pizza that's like almost completely uneaten and something like that, and I mean, I don't know. That's just that sounds like a lot of premeditation, especially when you have the video of a woman saying to Kaylee Anthony, "I kill." It's just like, this seems so premeditated, and it's just it's ridiculous. It's disgusting. It's abhorrent. It's terrible. There's so many negative adjectives that just come to mind. But I guess that's the world we live in, and that's one of the things, though, that happens in most true crime cases. This one, I think, really struck a nerve with a lot of people because of it just seems kind of exceptionally heinous. It's the concept of a mother murdering her own daughter so she could go out and drink, so she could continue her relationship with a club promoter, so she could stay out late at night and get involved in the party and nightclub scene. The most selfish, superficial, materialistic things in the world. And it's just like, who was that tattoo that she had? La Bella Vita or something like that? Beautiful life. I mean, that's why people get so pulled into this case. It's just like, kind of, what on earth? Do people like that really exist? However, though, if we actually want to be talking about the hard evidence again, I mean, this seems like something that's really kind of swaying something toward Casey Anthony's guilt. However, we always have those comments from Geraldo Rivera when he was like, even if she had been found guilty, she would have won the appeal. Because the prosecution told the jury that there were 80 searches for chloroform on the computer, and that was incorrect. There was actually only one. They heard incorrect information. She would have won the appeal because in America, you have the right to a fair trial. And if the jury hears even one piece of evidence that is incorrect, you did not get a fair trial. They convicted you based on some false evidence. You did not get a fair trial. I don't know. I would just kind of ask that as kind of like a challenge question. What do you think about that? Do you think Casey Anthony would have won her appeal? Secondarily, do you think that there could be any other plausible explanation for duct tape being found on Kaylee Anthony's skull other than murder? Or, I mean, we're of course including things, manslaughter, death of homicide by any other reason. I mean, not talking about legal terminology here. Do you think that there could be any explanation other than Casey Anthony intentionally caused the death of her daughter? I would love to hear any of your comments below. If you have anything to say at all, please drop a comment below. I would love to hear from you. Until next time.